Not that there are many slides, I only have a few actually. A little bit about me. I work with Catman solution and have been so for a collective amount of about 10 years in sections of 5 years a long time ago, and now the last 5 years. In between, I've been doing logistics, healthcare, and government BI, and now I'm back into retail BI. I span a lot of technologies, Azure Data, with a history of multidimensional databases and Tabular, of course, lately. Then Power BI and way back C#, and that has helped me, pick up on PowerShell and so on. IoT is more of a interest rather than something work-related. So these are some of the customers that we've signed this last year. Some may be familiar to you and some may not. Currently we roam in the Nordics, so Denmark, Sweden, and Norway, and we have a single customer in Netherlands as well. We try to grow with the existing customers who are more than a local company, so some of them span globally, as you see, and we try to grow with them globally as well. This year has been particularly exciting in the retail industry because, the COVID situation, and that forced us, or not forced us, that enticed us to actually do a kind of a lockdown report for our clients. And this is the moment where the Danish Prime Minister actually locked Denmark down for the first time, and as you can see, for some of our customers, that actually made a huge increase in sales, and to some surprise, it was actually toilet paper that was actually sought for. And we have both insights in the retail sellout data, as well as online promotion data, so we can actually track when people are searching for different kinds of goods. And momentarily after the lockdown was announced, everybody was searching for the best offer on toilet paper. Actually, it's sometimes you can have fun with data, but I guess you all know how to have fun with data. So the session is a bit crammed. I'll hopefully complete the total tour in 1 hour. And we will see a different variety of sources and targets for different tools of deploying tabular models and Power BI files. We will go over Visual Studio, Tabular Editor, and scripting as well. We will touch on, if we get there, Azure DevOps for automated deployments, and also some maybe lesser known tools that actually existed before tabular models were around. So this is more kind of a menu up front, and I believe this is the last slide in my deck, so I will be moving on to demos after this. So following the agenda, we will be initiating this session with a regular Power BI desktop file. As you can see, I'm just gonna delete this page. And we have a custom-made Power BI desktop file with the model. You can see this is the model view. This is tapping into some of our process metrics on servers and events and tabular processing and so on, and file loading. We serve about 60 plus customers and load their point of sale data into their own data warehouse instance. So we have about 60 databases that serve up 60 analysis services tabular models, which is then again referenced in Power BI. And of course, we need to monitor that everything is going by the book. So we built a little model on top of that data, and this is more of a investigation tool than it is something for reporting. I've just pulled in a single measure, and in order for me to publish that into Power BI service, I can hit publish. And now I see that it's actually changed users. And this is something that the Power BI desktop file or the Power BI desktop application is a bit of a naughty boy lately, changing users. And now it's taking a really long time to authenticate. Obviously, we use several credentials internally and as well with our clients. So we tend to switch around rather often. And we have some accounts that go, have admin permissions on the service, but some are specific to target certain users. All right, so this is actually not what I wanted, but we can go with this. I have a workspace Catman solution. And if we go and look at that here, you can see that Catman solution is here. And for the quick-eyed, you'd notice that this is not a premium capacity workspace. So it's a shared service hosted workspace. And I can still select that to publish my report, both report and dataset. And I want to replace that. And then the Power BI desktop application publishes this to the service, and I can then open the report and see that. Let's get in here. And there's a new report here. I can open it and see that my measure is displayed here. I could also upload it via the service and have the same result as you just saw. I guess this is basic and common knowledge for everyone attending. If not, this is how you leverage the Power BI desktop application to actually share your reports with others and also have it available in the service. I could actually use the Tabular Editor to also deploy the model of the Power BI desktop file. This requires the Power BI desktop file to be opened. And now I'm just going to open Tabular Editor, which is a tool developed by the Danish MVP Daniel Otiger. And if you don't know this tool, you should definitely look into it. It has several advanced options to some of the existing tools. Both the user interface here is rather quick, and it also has a command line CLI executable exe file that you can actually use to script some of the deployments and changes. We'll see that later in the Azure DevOps deployments. But this one can actually, as you noticed, I have the Power BI desktop file running. And I can actually then just connect to a local instance, which is where my report is hosted. So I'm connecting into the Power BI desktop file and seeing that model. I have a couple of options within the Tabular Editor. I can save this to a folder. I'm just going to create a folder for you to see, like this. And this is something that is unique to Tabular Editor. So if we look at what's actually in that folder, it's a JSON representation of all the objects in the tabular model. So if we look at this one, it'll have just a definition for the database. So we can see that object on its own. And it's split out into all the dimensions or tables that you have in your tabular model, and all the columns and so on is scripted out here. And one of the neat features that this allows you to actually do is that you can actually alter automatically what you want to combine later on, because you can actually, with the Tabular Editor, load from this format as well. So if you want to create a custom look for some customers, you can actually just have it exported to this format and delete on a file basis setting, and then load it into a model and deploy it afterwards. So you can host different editions of the same model for different customers. But the deployment in itself is set up here in the model deploy, and it'll take you through a wizard kind of thing. So you have the option to actually deploy it onto an instance of Azure Analysis Services, or as you can see, I could actually deploy this to a premium capacity workspace. So let's just go have a look at the dev test premium capacity workspace and see that there are no reports or models in here called report. Now it's prompting me to log in to my tenant. I'll do that. And then I can select if I want to override some of the existing models in there, or I want to have my own created. I just type in a database name, and I can deploy the model structure. I don't want to deploy roles, and I'm just going to deploy. So in a second, we will see it pop up over here. But the difference, the main difference is that this is only going to be the data set that is published. The report is not part of this deployment. Okay. So, yeah, any questions?
No. Just I wanted to say, okay, thank you.
Okay. Okay. So pbix files using Azure DevOps, and now we move into the automation stuff. And for that, we can have a look at, maybe I should do like this, just create a repo in Azure DevOps. Azure DevOps is something you can get for free. You have a free subscription for up to 5 developers, I think it is. Last I looked, they may have changed that, so please go look it up. But you get, I think, a free unlimited amount of repos in here. And if we select to upload our file in here, I specifically put that report in the datamines folder on my C drive, and I can add a comment on what I changed. I can select if we have a branching strategy, what kind of branch or which branch I'm actually deploying, committing this to. And now I'm, in a sense, uploading my Power BI report file to the service or to the repository. And as you can see, Azure DevOps doesn't really know what the pbix file is. You can download it. And you might say, so how is this going to benefit me? Well, in the pipelines section in Azure DevOps, you can actually set up automated deployments that trigger once code changes. So we'll just set that up. I'll just go back here and I'll just delete this report so we're sure it's not here. And I'll just create a new release pipeline. And I'll just select that as an empty job. And we will call that data mines release pipeline. Oop. Finish letter.
Jens, one question though.
Yes.
It's still about Tabular Editor. Would Tabular Editor actually also allow us to publish to our Power BI report server?
I don't know that actually.
Yeah, I didn't either. So.
In fact, I don't know.
We'll check it. Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Okay. So we can have a look at the documentation of the Tabular Editor and see what that says.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you.
No worries. So once I set up a pipeline, I kind of have to create a stage. I can have multiple stages so that this is kind of the dev environment, and then I can clone that once I've done it and then set it up for production, which then runs after dev is completed. I can also set up triggers after release, manual only. Is it on a schedule? Does it require a pull request, which is a common thing coders among? I can set up that I want pre-deployment approvals. So I can say that, okay, so for this to go through, we want my colleague Eric to actually approve that this is moving forward. I can have gated deployments, and there are a number of options in here, but we'll just keep it simple for this example. And obviously, I have to add an artifact that is the base of my deployment. And it just so happens that Azure DevOps supports that I can actually reference a repository. So let me find Playground. And I want the default branch to be main, which is the only one at the current time. And then I want the latest from the default branch. I can set up different editions of this. So latest, a specific commit, then I have to, say which commit I want to have deployed. And a commit is like saving a new edition of the file. Then that's a commit to the branch. I can have it specified at the time of release, but I'll just go with the latest. And I don't really care for the rest of the parameters in here. So I just add this artifact in here, and I'll just go and add my first task. So in here, we can see that this agent job is actually running on an Azure DevOps agent that is Visual Studio 2017 and Windows 2016. We can have different editions, and depends on what your requirements are. You can even create your own build agent, and we may see that later because we have those some of those running because we have some special requirements to some pre-installed stuff on the servers. But for this agent job, we can add a task. And if we go look for Power BI, we'll see that the marketplace actually has a number of options for Power BI deployments. We have a couple of those installed on our instance, and I want this Power BI action to be the task that I want to do. So this task has several options. I can create a new workspace, delete an existing, add new user to a workspace, service principal, security group, refresh a data set. So I can actually have that done as a task in my deployment, or I can upload a PBI report. So I know this was the dev test workspace, and maybe the most important thing is that you need to set up a connection from Azure DevOps to Power BI. And I have one already, but if we go have a look at how that is done, it's actually pretty straightforward. And if this thing loads, so you can create a new service connection. And they have a couple of options, but some of them are deprecated. So we will go by the Power BI service connection. And in here, you can actually say if you want it by username, password, or you have a service principal, which is something you create in your Azure Active Directory. And what kind of organization type do you have? What's the tenant ID and client ID, client secret, if it's service principal, or username password if it's this kind of authentication. So we've set that up already and called it Power BI Azure DevOps. And the only thing left is to select the source file. So now, since I'm linking to the repo, I can browse all the files in there, and I can say I want to deploy fancy token in here and playground report pbix. I want to override the Power BI file if it exists. This means that this job can run again and again. And I can create if the workspace does not exist. Now I haven't, there's another task.
One question.
Yep.
So the deployment deploys to a single workspace. So if we're managing multiple workspaces with multiple reports, how would you go to manage the multiple workspaces? Do you go for multiple repos? Is there parameterization going on, something else? Or is that going to come in a demo?
It's not going to come in a demo, but I can say that there are some shortcomings to, now I'm not using YAML, which is the new flavor for creating these pipelines.
A pain in the butt, yes.
Yes, and maybe that's the most important thing in regards to why I'm not using YAML, because I haven't had the time to, go into the details of that. But one thing that this engine lacks is a loop functionality. So in this example where I wanted to publish this report to a number of workspaces, I would have to set up a single publish action for each workspace. You could generate the YAML via some kind of tool, obviously, and then have it execute that. because you can actually execute these pipelines via an API that is exposed by the Azure DevOps service. So you could actually programmatically do something smart there. An alternative to that is to use some kind of PowerShell stuff to leverage the capabilities of PowerShell and the fact that you can actually inject stuff. There are several commandlets which you can use for that with the API for Power BI.
Okay, so a few more questions. Can we also update the app parts with a deployment pipeline, or is that currently not possible?
This Power BI action, you can't do it, but I think there's a tenant setting where you can actually, I'm not sure if you can set that at a tenant level that you ought to update, but let's see if
I think you still manually have to publish the app, that there is no automated action for that available.
But then maybe you could have a task calling the Power BI REST API. I think the Power BI REST API would expose something to update the app, maybe.
No, there's no APIs for it yet. That's why I don't think it's possible. So so one last question, and then we'll allow you to go on. It's possible that you missed this, but can we also deploy to non-premium workspaces with Azure DevOps?
Yes. So I'll just run this one quickly, and we can take it.
Definitely.
There's no distinction for this tool if it's a premium or non-premium.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, so I've set up my task. I've connected Azure DevOps and Power BI in terms of a connection like this. And I've set my action, which workspace I want. I can, if I want, actually, maybe that would be the most cunning way of actually doing multiple workspaces with the same report. You could have what's called a variable in here. And if we add that in here, we can say that the default value is dev test, but you can have it settable at release time. So this means that if I go back and save this one, I will have a release definition up here, and I can actually call the Azure DevOps REST API with a parameter that says workspace, and then the report is actually published to that. So you wouldn't have to do the looping in here, but you could do the looping somewhere else. Okay, so we set up, this is quite important, continuous deployment trigger for Git Playground. So we enable that every time a push occurs, we trigger this pipeline. So as we saw before, we have this report with just one page. And now we want to see failed loads here, and we want to see distinct count. Like this. I'm going to save that. And then we're going to go back to the repo. I'm then going to go upload the file. And I could add a comment, but I'm just going to commit it. And now we see that just now we've changed something in this file. If we go back to releases, we will see that, where did my release go? Let's release pipeline. And we see it's queued. An agent is ready for the job. So Azure DevOps has assigned an agent for my pipeline. And now it's initiating the job. It's getting the artifacts, which is in this case the report. And then it's actually doing the Power BI action. So now we should, in a second, well, there we go. It should be, there we go. So we see the report, both dataset and report is actually uploaded into the workspace, and we can see that the count of failed loads is present in the report. Now, I know that Just Blindbæk, another Danish MVP, is signed up for this session. I don't know if he's here, but he has a session on actually.
I saw him come in, yeah.
Okay, splitting the model into reports and model. And this way you can actually manage when you want to do model changes and when you want to do report changes only. So we can see the job finished. And if we go back, we can edit the pipeline again. And we can go to this one and just check. Delete this one. Also this one. And then we're going to edit this one to say I haven't obviously tested this up front, but I'm afraid there's some permissions with the workspace, but let's see. So we create a new release. We could do or trigger a change with the uploading a new file, or we can just simply create a new release, which is then set off with the parameters that we've set now. So we can see that the value of workspace is Catman solution. And we can go and have a look at the logs and see that, again, the agent is ready. And if you have a lot of work going on, you might end up waiting on different jobs, waiting for agents to finish other jobs and so on. So that depends on the workload that you have. So we can see the details, what it's actually doing, the publish action. And now we should see both report and dataset come up in the non-premium workspace. All right. Questions on that?
No questions. Excellent.
Okay. So let me just check. So that was Azure DevOps. And so, yeah, Visual Studio. Obviously, when you go from Power BI development and splitting, as we just talked about, model and reports into separate files, the next logical step in terms of scale is actually having a Visual Studio project for your model. So let's have a look at one of those, and we can have a look at our model. So as you can see, a lot of tables. If we're gonna go look at the model in here, you can see that it takes a little while for Visual Studio to actually load the model. I have a fairly new laptop here, but sometimes it's actually struggling, and I'm not sure if the fact that I'm presenting on Teams is a beneficial factor in this. It seems
it's
that
not, it's not the laptop though. It's Visual Studio.
Yeah, yeah. So once it's loaded, and I knew I shouldn't have shown you the model because it's taking a lot of time. Obviously, there's a lot of tables in here, and depending on the size of your model, this is more or less easy to work with. As you grow, Tabular Editor becomes the more normal tool for changes in here, because if you have to wait this long every time, it's a nightmare. So no, this model is fairly large and complex, but that's really besides the point. So deployment from Visual Studio is actually managed on the project. So we have properties for the project where you can actually say, okay, so either you want to deploy the project to a local instance. I have no local instance running, so I can't really demonstrate that. But what I do have is a test server, and if we're quick, we have it scaled down during off business hours. So if we can do this quick, we can actually test it out. So this is a datamines.dk. Maybe I should model on this Azure Analysis Services instance. I have a couple of options for processing. If I want to process it default, full, or do not process, I can have it do a transactional deployment and roll back entirely if I want to. But as soon as that is set up, right-clicking on the project actually allows you to deploy. And as you can see, it's validating credentials. So once you deploy the model out, you have to have apply the credentials. Now I happen to have them in handy. So we have a couple of here. This. And if the server has not been downgraded, I will be able to deploy this. Otherwise, it's actually full. So this should be a fairly quick task because I stated that I didn't want it to be processed. So let's go have a look at the test server. This one. Yep, I need some credentials for that, and also for this one. And I didn't get to get there before. So now you won't believe me, but there's a datamines B model deployed here. So we can just have a look at this. Yeah, I guess that's fairly obvious that I just deployed that. You can see the different metadata for the database. You can go browse the tables. It's in here, and also roles that we've set from the project. Also, connections are set, so we should be able to process this one. I'm not going to do that because that takes precious time out of this session. So this is a way of actually deploying your Visual Studio tabular models to a server. And I can do that as well with the Tabular Editor. So let's have a look at that. Now I want to open from a file. And now it's looking for a model.bim. And I have to go find It's actually easier there. This one. And here's the model.bim. You can open that up. And as you can see, now it's loaded in the Tabular Editor, and we can see the tables. So a much quicker editor than Visual Studio. Obviously, we don't have the fancy stuff of Visual Studio, but we can, do all the necessary stuff in here. And if you haven't looked into Tabular Editor, you should after this session. So I can actually deploy this one as well. And I can deploy that to the same test server. It's asking me for credentials. That's okay. And then I can override one of the models that is already there. And as you can see, the one that we just created is gone. So next data mines BE, we're going to create that again. I want to deploy roles and model and deploy. And here we are again. Deployed right on time, right? We have the same tables, connections, and so on. The main difference now is that if I wanted to process this one, I think it's going to break because it's not. So I can just maybe try one of the smaller ones because the connections are not set. As you saw before with Visual Studio, I need to actually add in the credentials. And now you can see that the error that I get is login failed for user on the database. So after I deploy it from Tabular Editor, I need to go in and refresh credentials like this on each of my connections. That can obviously be scripted, and I know on the blog for Tabular Editor there are several options to do that. So it's no big deal. It's just something to keep in mind. And delete and back to agenda, because this was and I think we saw the Azure Analysis Services for Tabular Editor and Visual Studio. And with time in mind, I think we should skip to Azure DevOps using PowerShell. Or maybe I should just do this one first. So there is a tool that is lesser known. It's residing in a folder in this path. So if you can see the path up here, it's C program files x86, Microsoft SQL Server, and whatever edition you have, tools, bin, Management Studio. So it comes with Management Studio. And it's called Microsoft Analysis Services Deployment exe. Now, if I open up another, let's see, we have something in here. No, that's a folder as well. So we go to fetch the one that was here, the one that we just used. So if I take this one and put it in data mines folder, so it's easier to, and I rename that to database. I can go in with this tool, and this can actually be run unattended as well. You can see it's analysis services deployment wizard. And it's used both for multidimensional, and that's where it's originated. And you can use it for Tabular as well, with some minor hacks. So data mines. Oh, it's called AS database. That's true. That now it's coming up. So it knows the JSON that is in the model. So I didn't change the file at all. I can deploy this to the server. Let's pick that name up again. Like that. And I want to call it next data mines. Deleted the other one, yes. It's prompting me to log on to the server. Deploy partitions, deploy roles, and retain members. Now I have a couple of other elements here as well. You can set the connection strings and so on. I can set processing or not. Next, I can create a deployment script, which will be stored on my laptop, and I can just execute that afterwards, or I can just click next. It's running through, can I do it or not? It's creating the script in memory.
Hey Jens, while that's running, one question.
Yes.
Can we use the analysis service deployment wizard in a SQL agent job? So having it a bit more automated?
I guess so. You could invoke that from a PowerShell command, which is doable in a SQL agent.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah.
So when I click finish, it's gonna deploy. Where did it go? And there we go. Once again, we deployed a new edition of DataMine's B tabular model. So that was a lesser known tool maybe. All right, moving on to a more complex model deployment. So whenever we have a new client, we have configured a release pipeline set up to release just the all the stuff that we need for new clients to be onboarded. And this is our model comes in different editions or language settings and different. It's not just different languages, it's also different models. So we have a release pipeline for the Danish, the Dutch, and the Swedish model. The Norwegian model is contained within the Danish script. So as you can see before, we have a dependency on a repository, which is a pipeline that builds, and in basic sense, it's just packing the model.bim file into an Azure DevOps artifact, which we then can use in our deployment. And then we have a dependency on our deployment scripts. So we have some PowerShell running, which is actually doing all kinds of stuff with the model in terms of customizing it to each and individual customer we have. We have continuous deployment trigger on changes to the model, not to the tabular deployment scripts. So we don't deploy the model every time there is a change to the way we deploy it, only to what we deploy. So that's configurable as well. So you can set up which artifact is going to trigger the deployment. We have two stages, test and production. And actually our only task in this test is actually to run this deploy tabular script with a bunch of parameters. So we have some variable groups which you can set up. So there's a password, a username, database password, server username, model, which is something we use in the script, and which project we're going to take from the repository. And once that script is running, so let's just see a completed section. So we can see it's almost as simple on the covers as the one we saw before. We can see that it takes about 18 minutes for us to run a complete deployment cycle in production. And this is a looped deployment. So this is where we deploy one client, the next client, third client, and so on. And you can see the list is quite long. And all of this information is actually grabbed from a metadata database. So we have operations sitting and maintaining metadata on our clients. And this job actually just sniffs into that database and deploys whoever is active in there. But this is actually only for changes to the model. So setting up a new client is somewhat more elaborate. We can see that if we want to set up a full deployment, we can specify up front that if we want to deploy the Danish, the Dutch, or the Swedish edition, that's all set by variables in here. And as you can see, we have a number of variables to configure for each deployment. And the tasks that we perform are grouped into stages, so to speak. So some of our clients use an application called Store Pictures, where they can actually take pictures in the stores and save them to a blob folder, and we build a model on top of that, which is integrated into the tabular model with the point of sales data. So obviously we need to set that up. And we also need to create a Store Pictures metadata database, which is then added to an elastic pool that is running already. So we kind of use the variables to create that and then add it to an elastic pool to save, obviously, money. We do that for the data warehouse database as well, which is called ClientDB, and we have an elastic pool for that as well. So setting up the tabular database, we transform some values into.
Jens, one question.
Yes.
Yep. Is there a specific variable that we can use to specify the edition we're going to deploy to?
Well, we're going to have a look at the script in a second, and okay. I can show you where you can actually change that.
Excellent, thank you.
So we have some variables we transform, and then we use Tabular Editor on this deployment agent. And in order for that to be installed, we use Chocolatey, which is a platform for installing different applications on servers. So we actually just install the Chocolatey tool on this instance, and then we run this command where we actually install Tabular Editor, which is packaged in Chocolatey, and then we deploy the model using parameters to start the Tabular Editor with a command line expression. Obviously, this leverages, and we do not use that yet, a lot of options which the Tabular Editor already has, which is testing and validating code conformity and so on. So there's a lot of options that we haven't yet explored with the Tabular Editor for deploying these models. As you noticed earlier, using the Tabular Editor, we need to refresh all the credentials. We do that using PowerShell. And finally, we set up Power BI workspaces as a part of this. And we add our Catman group, the Office 365 group that we are all in the company in, or everyone who's actually doing something on Power BI is in that group, and we are adding those to the workspace, so we ensure that they are admins on the workspace, so anyone in the office can actually add other users and so on. Obviously, there are no reports yet in this one, but that's a fairly easy addition to setting up the Power BI part of this, actually deciding on which kind of report package they need. And we can then add that variable at the end. So this is another use of the Tabular Editor, as you saw, like this. So we start /wait Tabular Editor. So this means because this flag is set, it knows that it's Visual Studio, or it's, well, maybe it's not this one. I can't remember. One of the parameters is saying that this is an Azure DevOps run, so you need to output the debug log into a readable format for the deployment engine up here. So you can actually have tests run and then deployed, and Azure DevOps will understand the results of that test run. And
Jens, one
yes.
question. Is there a reason you're not using Docker in conjunction with the VM, as this would allow a developer to deploy both locally and remotely?
You mean the agent?
Yeah, the agents and artifacts as well. I think, unless they have something else in mind with the question.
I've actually tried to set up a Docker container as agent, but I can't remember. It came short somehow in instantiating because we also wanted to deploy in parallel, for instance, and we could do that using containers. But there is some restriction. I can't remember the roadblock actually that I hit when trying to set that up. So we have actually investigated that path.
Yeah, okay.
But I wasn't able to complete the mission, so to speak, with that technology. But that's obvious way you want to go if you want to, parallelize and do a much more efficient deployment than we do.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you.
So I think I already demonstrated the export to folder, but that's something we've been looking into actually to modify the folder structure in here. So once you call the Tabular Editor in here, you can actually call the export to folder feature. And then you can have some tasks modifying the files in there and then actually deploy the model. But currently we use a PowerShell script, and I've tried to narrow it down to some areas of interest. Now we have a couple of parameters that we use. We have a target server where we want to deploy the database name, username, password, which is variables all in Azure DevOps. And as you can maybe saw in there, variables that are sensitive are actually hidden. So that's a nice way to actually ensure that you're not spilling information all over the place. Obviously, we also put in the build number. So once an artifact is built, it provides a build number, and that's actually viewable in our tabular models. So we can also check, okay, we have this error, we know it's this build number, so we can easily go back and see where we need to look, which commit or which release we want to look at. Obviously, some source database blob folder information, the culture that we need to set, and if it's going to be a full refresh or just a default. We begin out by logging some information that we just received. We have created an internal function in this script, which we call at the end here, with all the parameters, and after we load the model into the model base variable, so to speak. So we pass that on to this method as well, all the JSON for the model. And so I'm not going to bore you with all the details, but we obviously load up Azure Analysis Services tabular assemblies, and which is why we require those to be installed on the build engine. And we then deserialize the JSON that we have and create an object db_bim, which we then can actually manipulate afterwards. Now we log all of the parameters that we received and start manipulating the object. So we connect to the target database or target server that we want to deploy the database to. And then we fetch the database if it's there already. And then we preserve the roles that exist. So this is actually a way of actually preserving the roles and also the members of those roles if any were changed in production. And they usually are. We don't store our role membership into code. So this is a way of actually bringing the database back to the previous state access-wise. So we connect to the base and preserve the roles. We turn the model into a JSON object with a serialize options. We then go through the object to actually find some of the expressions that we need to replace. Obviously, when you check in code in development, you have certain settings. You want to test this deployment or this development branch against one of the clients because they had an issue, and we need that data to be present in the models and so on. But we want to, rise above the fact that we have differentiating connection strings all the time. So we need to replace with whatever parameters we set for this run. So in a sense, we just change connection strings here. Then we set culture, and this is also where you could set the edition in this section. You obviously would have to be aware of any non-compliance to editions. If you use a functionality that is not, available to that edition, then your deployment will fail. We then serialize the database, and we change so that it becomes a create or replace request rather than a create, which is the default it's creating. And then we add the build number into the release number measure. So we have a measure in the model that just says release no, and then we inject the release number with a URL to the build, which is actually the one we're deploying here. Finally, we execute the script against the server which we connected to, and then we update all of the source database and blob folder connections with source database server name and so on. So once we've done that, we go back to restore the roles. So we run through the collection of roles that we harvested up front, and then we add them with a create or replace with a role and members added to that. If we had no roles created, so anyone wiped the roles or members, we create the default data reader process and admin roles in there. And finally, we write done. So this is the job that you all saw in effect before. Let me just get back to that one. It's slow now. Releases. Not sure why releases is this slow. So this is where, if we look at the log, we can see that 3910 is the one that was deployed. And this one, so we actually see that the build number is 3910, and you can see that servers connected, number of rows to preserve is 8. So they have another setup, and we deploy those after the model is ready for deployment, and it's deployed. So we restore the rows afterwards and process and done. And then all over again for the next client, and so on and so on. Okay, I think I ran over a couple of minutes, maybe. Otherwise, we can take some questions if questions are.
Yeah, thank you, Jens. There's one specific question that I'd like you to weigh in on. Could we use the option that we were just discussing as well to publish development UAT production models and still change the link to the shared data sets? Right now, we have to fix this once we deploy, even with the deploy pipelines from within Power BI itself.
The question is if we want to deploy what tabular models or Power BI desktop files, or what are you?
So it's probably Power BI. It's Power BI files.
Yeah. And connecting to or doing this kind of manipulation with Power BI files is really, really tricky. It's never. I've never succeeded in actually opening up a Power BI desktop file as a, you can open it by renaming it zip and then changing stuff in there and then renaming it to pbix again. But then the Power BI desktop application won't recognize the format anymore. So the Power BI desktop application is really, really nitty-gritty about the format and who gets to tamper with the file. So I don't think that's possible at the current state. I know there's work going on in the Power BI team to actually, they are aware that this is an issue. So hopefully something is coming along for this.
Mm-hmm. Okay. If there's any questions, then yeah, I don't know. I know, but that's Rui's solutions are hacky by definition. So
yeah.
Do look at those, but do check him out first on non-production reports. But yeah, Rui has some very creative solutions. I do agree.